of recent trends in housing affordability, and what is the government doing to address the challenge of homelessness?
Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. On homelessness, we've just come from about an hour and a quarter, hour and a half debate in the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party on what various members of the party have found in their local communities on the homelessness front. They've been out visiting shelters for the homeless. And also, what is now an emerging new development, which is the fact that homeless shelters are now having to cope with people who are falling out of the actual housing market because they can't afford to pay their mortgages. This is the most serious debate and discussion that we had, because those who have traditionally provided shelter services are now having to deal with a whole group of families who now for the first time are having to rely upon various charities across the country to provide them with transitional accommodation, and in some cases crisis accommodation, because affordability has become such a real problem. Some of the statistics referred to in the report by the AMP today and NatSem are worth recording for the House, and I note these weren't referred to in the earlier question to me. The report describes the 1995-1996 to 2005-2006 period as a decade of dwindling hope. What are the actual figures when it comes to housing affordability? And this is a figure which I think should sear itself into people's attention. In 95-96, according to this report, purchasing a typical home cost less than 5 times annual income. In 05-06, that ratio has blown out to 7.5 times annual income. Therein lies the core definition of the housing affordability problem. Whatever increases occurred in terms of households' disposable income at this period of time has not kept pace with the extraordinary explosion in overall housing costs. And that is the absolute core of the housing affordability problem. Response to an earlier question, I ran through our responses on housing affordability generally, a $500 million program, First Home Savers Account, a $500 million program to deal with affordable rental accommodation, which is designed to bring on to stock 100,000 additional units of affordable rental accommodation for the nation over time. And then thirdly, to deal with the real challenge which local authorities and state governments have brought to our attention nationwide, and the development industry itself, that is, how do you bring down the level of infrastructure charging on new housing developments? And that's why we have actually also put forward our proposal for a $500 million fund to deal with housing affordability, with the object of participating local authorities of bringing down local infrastructure charging by as much as 20%. This is one part of the problem. The other is when it flips over into actual homelessness itself. And here the data becomes so compelling. In the presentations I received from so many of my backbenchers today, and 38 of them spoke in the debate in the Parliamentary Party today, in the various centres that they visited right across the nation, from electorates spanning from Fremantle to Perth to Tasmania and to Launceston, the constant reply was that there is such a huge and growing turnaway rate for homeless shelters across the country. Turnaway rates of 40, 50, 100%, depending on where you are. This means that we have a problem in terms of the physical availability of crisis accommodation stock in the country. This is a big problem. The attendant problem is that with people who are using homelessness shelters, that the recurrence of the problem, that is people who use a homeless shelter, but through the inadequate provision of associated health facilities, dental facilities, mental health facilities, become return visitors to homeless shelters, is huge. This problem has not received sufficient ventilation in the national debate. It must do so. It is a crying shame for Australia that according to the census data, we have 100,000 people classified as homeless. It is a crying shame for Australia that according to the data, we have some 10,000 people who are sleeping rough each night. And the reports from individual caucus members about individual stories of distress, discomfort, and plain financial disaster are disturbing deeply. That is why the first white paper commissioned by this government is on homelessness. We have to get this right as a nation, not just in boosting the physical supply of stock for homeless across the country, but also to deal with it in a way where we actually bring down the number of people who use these services on a repeat basis. It's a core hallmark of whether we are a decent society or not. It therefore commands our attention, and these days it doubly commands our attention because of the data contained in this report, released today by NatSem and the AMP, which points to this ballooning housing affordability problem for working families everywhere, placing all of them in risk of one day having to contemplate the possibility of needing emergency accommodation themselves. That's why this government is determined to act in this area. It is of fundamental relevance to all working families.
The member for Macarthur, the Assistant Treasurer and the Minister for Housing. The member for Macarthur. The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Treasurer. I refer to the Treasurer's media statement of the 5th of March, which referred to the Household Final Consumption Expenditure Chain Price Index. Would the Treasurer explain to the House why this index is widely considered a broader measure of inflation than the headline CPI? Will the Treasurer confirm that the national accounts showed the index of household final consumption expenditure increased by 0.4% in the quarter, the second lowest quarterly rise in 2.5 years? Given that the national accounts showed that this measure of consumer price inflation moderating, does he now regret egging the Reserve Bank to hike interest rates with his intemperate remark, the inflation genie is out of the bottle?
Treasurer.
I thank the member for his question, and no, I don't regret it for one moment. And it is not more reliable than the CPI, and it is not more reliable than the Reserve Bank's underlying rate of